Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the very first seminar of the semester for the MIGS seminar series. Today we have Dr. Tyler Eddy. And before I get into that, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. So we respectfully acknowledge the land in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatchkavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation to honor this beautiful land together. So as mentioned, today we will hear from Dr. Tyler Eddy. Tyler is the team lead at the Life Aquatic and is a research scientist at the Fisheries and Marine Institute. Tyler lectures in the Fisheries Science Graduate Program. He teaches data collection, management, and display. Tyler is interested in past, present, and future human interactions with and ecology of marine ecosystems. Tyler is a founding coordinator of the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project and is a visiting scientist at the Charles Darwin Research Station in Galapagos Islands, Ecuador. Tyler was a research fellow at the University of South Carolina, a research associate at the University of British Columbia, and a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University. Tyler has a PhD in marine biology from Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, and an honors in Bachelor of Science in marine biology from Dalhousie University. So with that, I will now pass it off to Tyler for his presentation.
Is there any way we can minimize the panels just to make?
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, layout. There we go. Is that good?
Yep.
Welcome. Put that down like that.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to speak. So I don't think I've given one of the MI seminars yet. When I first started, they wrangled me into doing one of the Research Week seminars, which I know some of you have been wrangled into. But this was a nice opportunity to be able to kind of put together some of the research that yourselves in the audience and myself have been working on over the past 4 or so years since I've been here at the Marine Institute, as well as some of the work that we've got ongoing. So first off, I'd just like to acknowledge the team, some of you here in the audience. A lot of this work is the result of the postdocs and the PhDs or master's research that's ongoing. Let's go into my teacher mode. So confession, I'm not a Newfoundlander. I'm from the mainland. I'm from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, but we do have a connection with Newfoundland in that we used to fish on the Grand Banks. So these are fishing schooners, Grand Banks fishing schooners. I'm from Lunenburg, which is famous for the Blue Nose, which is the fishing schooner that could never be beaten by the Americans. So we used to have the Fisher's Cup or the Fisherman's Cup, which subsequently became the America's Cup. So we have a claim to fame of building very fast schooners that used to fish on the Grand Banks. So we all know about the history of the cod collapse, but something that is maybe not as well known is that the whole groundfish community collapsed during this period of time. And there's a paper that actually looked at a number of different metrics, including the biomass of cod during this transition period during the early 90s. And we can see here in this black line, if we had been tracking the biomass of the entire community, we might have had a couple year advance notice that there was something changing in the system ahead of the collapse of the cod fishery. So this is kind of a rationale of why we might consider things beyond just individual single species, and we might want to think about what's happening at the community level or at the ecosystem level. During this time period, the cod collapse was happened after the collapse of capelin, and we know that capelin is a really important forage fish for the system, and it's a key energy conduit through the system. So there was a lot of other changes that were happening, and not just the collapse of the cod fishery. And it's been shown that there's evidence of bottom-up regulation in the system. So this paper was led by Paul Regular, and Matt Robertson, who's a CFIR scientist, was a co-author on this. And it kind of challenged the misconception that it was only overfishing that led to the fishery or the cod fishery collapse. So this paper suggested that starvation-induced mortality associated with prey availability is an important component of natural mortality of northern cod. So if we look to how things changed after the collapse of the cod fishery, we can see here that cod is represented by piscivores in blue. So we can see this dramatic decline in the catches, and then we can see that the reds really start showing up as being the dominant component of catches in the region. And these are represented by shellfish. So the snow crab fishery really exploded after the cod fishery collapse. And what's interesting to note is that snow crab is worth about an order of magnitude more per unit weight as cod is. So when you think about the economics of the collapse and the recovery, there's some interesting dynamics that are at play here. And so in 2021, the shellfish sector represented 62% of the total landings in the province. However, it brought in 88% of the value. So this is a $1 billion industry. So when we start to think about the dynamics between groundfish and invertebrates, there's also some economics that you need to take into account if you're going to be thinking about fishing communities in general. And so then the question becomes, we've been kissing the cod for all these years, but maybe we should be kissing the crab instead. That's what's bringing the money in. So I'd like to just put this in a little bit of a wider context of the region. So we know that Newfoundland and Labrador is a highly dynamic system. Days like today, the winds that we have during this time of the year, we're reminded of this on a regular basis. So we have the Labrador Current coming down from the north, bringing cold, nutrient-rich water. We have the Gulf Stream bringing warm, salty water from the south. They both mix and collide on the Grand Banks. So this really fuels, the high productivity of the system, but it also means that it's highly dynamic and can be a challenge when we're trying to make predictions about what is happening for individual species that we might be fishing. The Labrador Sea is also important for the global carbon cycle, and this is a focus region for a Canada First Research Excellent Fund awarded project called Transforming Climate Action. That's a partnership between Dalhousie, Laval, UQAR, and MUN. So this is something, a focus region that we're going to be spending some more time on over the next 6 or 7 years. And when we think about the dynamics of the system, we often see variability in the North Atlantic Oscillation, or the NAO, between negative phases and positive phases. And basically, they relate to the amount of Arctic penetration that we get. So in negative phases, we have less Arctic penetration, so less influence of colder water from the north. And we can see what that would mean for bottom temperature and for thermal habitat for species that would be living on the bottom. So in this phase of the NAO, we'd have bottom temperatures that would be on the order of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. So this is representative of the period of the 60s. However, when we have positive phases of the NAO, we have more penetration from this cold Arctic air. And then we have a much reduced thermal habitat for species that need to have warmer temperatures. So the bottom temperature would be less than -1 degree Celsius. So we can see, based on what's happening with the climate variability, this is going to have implications for things that are using the benthic habitat. So this is work that Fred Sear at DFO has done, looking at this climate variability on about a 70-year time series here. And what we can see is during the 60s, we had a relative warm period. And then during the 70s and the 80s into the 90s, when the cod fishery collapsed, we had this colder period. And then in recent years, we have less kind of momentum in the system where, it's less of, staying in a warm phase or a cold phase for a decade or so. And it seems to be that there's more variability in the system. So we're kind of jumping between these warm and cold phases more frequently than we were historically. And that's thought to be one of the impacts of climate change. So we're kind of seeing the momentum or the variability of the system is changing in recent years. So now we've seen, in recent years that we have had declines in the cash cow or the snow crab. And so some of the questions that people are asking are, are we recovering to a groundfish regime or a cod regime? Are we starting to see, the crab numbers go down, and should we expect to have cod numbers increase in the fisheries? It's okay. And so to study these changes, we look at some different spatial structures, and we've been using the ecosystem production units as most of our unit of study. So this is work that's been done at DFO by Pierre Pepin and Mariano Cohen Alonso, and they basically have categorized these different ecosystem production units based on the species that are representative. And so we look at the 2J3K region, if you're familiar with the NAFO zones, which they refer to as the Newfoundland Shelf, as well as the Grand Banks, which is the 3LNO region here. So I'm going to be showing figures that are related to these different bioregions throughout the talk. And so this is the 2J3K region off of northern Newfoundland and southern Labrador. And so we've been trying to understand if we are transitioning from this invertebrate regime that we saw post-cod collapse to a groundfish regime. And so this figure here on the left shows you the proportion of fish or community biomass represented by groundfish in orange and invertebrates in purple. So we can really see that the proportion of the community dominated by invertebrates is decreasing. And we can look to see how these are changing through space and time as well. So that we can see, really during the 90s, these polygons that are colored purple are representative or dominated by invertebrate communities. And in the early 2010s, we start to see some of the piscivore communities starting to creep in from the south and along the shelf break to the most recent year in the time series in 2019, where we're almost completely dominated by piscivore communities. So we really have seen this rapid shift from the invertebrate dominated communities to more of a groundfish dominated community. We've also looked to at how predator and prey relationships have changed during this time period. So here we can read this as the beginning of the time series on the left. So this is 1995 up until 2019 on the right. And so the blue colors represent a positive relationship between groundfish and invertebrates. So basically from 1995 up until the early 2010s, as groundfish were increasing in biomass, invertebrates were also increasing in biomass. So they had a positive relationship with each other. And then we can see really here in the early 2010s, this relationship changed where the increase in groundfish biomass was corresponded to a decline in the biomass of invertebrates. So we've seen that the predator-prey relationships have changed. We've also, tried to answer this question of whether or not this community or this ecosystem that we're observing in these later years is representative of a recovery of the community that we saw before the cod collapse. So we've looked at a number of different metrics. So here we're using mean trophic level of community to represent whether or not it's dominated by invertebrates or groundfish. So groundfish feed at a higher trophic level. So you would expect a high trophic level community to be representative of a groundfish community. So we can see from the earlier part of the time series into more recent years that we have seen this higher trophic level of the community that we would expect with the pre-collapse state. However, if we look on the vertical axis where we look at the total fish biomass in the system, we can see that we've remained in this sort of low productivity phase or a low biomass phase throughout. So as we've recovered to a community that's more like it was pre-cod collapse, we haven't seen the total biomass of the system recover to what it was before the collapse of cod and the groundfish. So now when we're starting to think about this from a fisheries context, we might ask the question, what are the appropriate baselines or management reference points that we would use, given that, cod from an ecological perspective may have recovered. We're seeing, that it's dominating the communities. However, the total biomass of the system still remains relatively low. So we may have a limit reference point that would be based on this historical biomass of cod before the collapse of the fishery. And, we've started to see the recovery of the northern cod stock, but it's not recovered to what we saw historically. So then the question becomes, does this historical reference point, is it appropriate to use in modern times when we might have a different productivity regime of the ecosystem? So this is something that regions of the world that experience a lot of changes through time, such as Alaska, the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, where we see these dramatic changes in the climate and the ecosystem. These are, questions that people are grappling with. How do we manage these systems that change a lot through time? And so to address this question, we hosted a workshop in 2021 looking at fisheries management reference points and highly dynamic ecosystems. So this was a COVID workshop. We'd actually planned and booked hotels and meeting rooms to do it in person, and then COVID happened. So we did it on Zoom. We had keynote talks by Andre Punt, Jason Link, Anna Rindorf, and Robin Forrest. So we had lots of leading fisheries scientists who are thinking about these things. And as a result of this workshop, we did a survey of all the participants, and we asked them, about dynamic reference points, how they're used, what are the different methods that you can use to do so. And so some of the different methods that were identified were by accounting for variable productivity, using a dynamic unfished biomass of what your carrying capacity of the fishery might be. So that might change through time, using ecosystem models, a dynamic stock recruit relationship. And it was identified that in fisheries assessments, changing fisheries or ecosystem productivity was reported as an issue in 96% of respondents. So they are, seeing these cases where we are seeing the productivity changing. And then the question is, how do we manage the fisheries appropriately? But interestingly, 74% of respondents said they had never seen dynamic reference points implemented, and 16% said in very few instances. So this is kind of I guess from a theoretical point of view, it's one way that you could manage the fishery, but from a practical point of view, it hasn't really, been implemented yet that often. And a follow-up question we asked was, how often should you change a dynamic reference point? From a fisheries industry perspective, you don't want the reference point jumping all over the place, because that makes it harder to make predictions about how much fish you're going to land, how many people you can hire. So you like a little bit of stability from an industry point of view, but then you have to take into account that the system is changing. And so here our most common response was we should change the reference points when there's changes in the ecosystem. So that again requires an understanding of how the ecosystem is changing through time. And then we asked another question, if changing productivity is an issue, but we haven't seen dynamic reference points being implemented, what are some of the barriers to their implementation? And the institutional inertia and uncertainty about if the change is lasting were the most common responses. So basically, this type of managing, this way of managing fisheries is relatively new. And so trying to change things at DFO, if you've had any experience there, can be, I think a little bit difficult. People have done things in a certain way, and so there's a lot of momentum there to continue on. And then this uncertainty about if the change is lasting. So, you might change a reference point, but if your productivity regime changes in the next year or two, how do you deal with these types of things? The next common responses were difficulty to operationalize and a lack of consistent methods. And so this kind of introduces the idea of managing things at the ecosystem. So you've probably heard about ecosystem-based fisheries management. It's the idea that instead of working at the scale of individual species or stocks, we think about how the whole ecosystem is responding and manage fisheries within that context. So there's a ton of literature out there about EBFM, but we really wanted to try to distill what the kind of common approaches are that you can take to EBFM across the literature, and what are the key principles. So with Abe Solberg, who's a PhD candidate here, we did a literature review, and we identified a number of common approaches, including ecosystem indicators, ecosystem models, stakeholder consultation, and area-based management, or your MPAs or your MCAs. And then we evaluated each of these different approaches for their ability to achieve these key ecosystem-based fisheries management principles. And one of the main conclusions of this study was that effective EBFM implementation and positive socio-ecological outcomes require the strategic use of multiple complementary approaches. So there's not one approach that's going to tick all these boxes for you. So you're going to have to kind of use a bit of a mix of approaches depending on, you know, your system and what the most important things that you're trying to achieve. And to illustrate this for capelin in the region, we considered, you know, how you might think about capelin management from a single species perspective compared to an EBFM perspective. So from a single species perspective, your objective of managing capelin would be to maintain an optimal yield of capelin. So oftentimes we use maximum sustainable yield, like MSY, as a target that we try to achieve. If you're thinking about this from an EBFM perspective, you'd be thinking more about maintaining the ecosystem structure and function. And we know for forage fish, they really play a supportive role to a lot of higher trophic level species. So you might try to manage a bit more conservatively if you're thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective. Our indicator from a single species perspective, we'd be thinking about the stock biomass. So this is what gets reported at the DFO assessments. From an EBFM perspective, we think about the stock biomass, and then again, this importance to the ecosystem. What role is it playing within the system? Our operational objectives would likely differ. So from a single species perspective, we might have a threshold of 400 kilotons, whereas we might want to keep more biomass in the system from an EBFM perspective. So we might want to keep it at, you know, 600 kilotons. And then our harvest control rule, or our total allowable catch, would vary accordingly. So we'd have perhaps, you know, a total allowable catch of 10 kilotons under an EBFM perspective versus 20 kilotons under a single species perspective. So in this study, one of the common approaches that we found to approach EBFM were ecosystem models. So these are basically, you know, food web representations of how energy is flowing through the system, who's eating who, and we can use them to describe the ecosystem structure and function, how the energy is flowing. We can use this to consider the influence of the environment. So if we know that the climate is fluctuating through time, we can incorporate that into our models. We can consider feeding interactions. So if we're thinking about capelin, you know, how is it supporting all these other things in the system? We can use them to run management strategy evaluations. So if we increase the fishery for capelin, or if we halve the fishery for capelin, what does that mean for the rest of the system? We can use them to run climate change scenarios. And also they oftentimes will help you prioritize future research efforts. So if you try to put together all of the different species that are in an ecosystem, you're probably going to find out that there's some gaps in the data. And so you can say, we know nothing about zooplankton in the region. They seem to be really important. Maybe we should put someone on, you know, studying what's happening with zooplankton. So we've been working hard over the past few years trying to put together an ensemble of ecosystem models for the region. So for the Grand Banks, we've got some size-based models underway. So this is the MIGS package you might be familiar with, ecopath model, a species distribution model, and a model of intermediate complexity referred to as the MICE model. And then for the 2J3K region, we've got a size spectrum model that's underway, as well as an ecopath model. And then we've also got an ecopath model for the North Water Polynya in the Arctic. So now we start to have a number of tools that we can look at from these specific fisheries and ecosystem questions. So Alana Woodrick, for her master's thesis, updated some of the existing ecopath models. And originally we had an ecopath model that encompassed all of 2J, 3K, LNO in one big box, which basically puts all the biomass of the system in one big box. And because we wanted to make it compatible with these ecosystem production units, we broke it down into two separate models. So now we have a model for 2J, 3K and for 3 LNO. And now that we have these more recent models for the 2018 to 2020 period, we can compare them through time through these different time periods where we have these snapshots of what was happening in the ecosystem. So we can look at things such as total ecosystem biomass, so that we've seen in recent years that we haven't hit that biomass level that we saw pre-cod collapse. And we can look to see that perhaps, we are seeing an increase in the total ecosystem biomass, but we're still not at the levels that it was historically. And then we can also look to see how this has changed through time by these major functional groups. We can zero in on some of the different communities. So the total fish biomass, again, we see that we're still at a relatively low level compared to the pre-collapse levels. And now we can start to compare the 2J3K region to the 3LNO region and how the different compositions of functional groups have changed through time. We also look at the invertebrate biomass, and here we really see that dramatic increase in invertebrate biomass following the cod collapse, here represented largely by shrimp during this 2013 to 2015 period. And then again, in the more recent period, now we can compare the 2J3K region, which has a high biomass of shrimp, compared to the 3LNO region, which has a higher biomass of snow crab. And if we look at fisheries catches across these three time periods, so 85 to 87, 2013 to 2015, and 2018 to 2020 for 2J3K and 3LNO, we can really see that at present, our total volume of fisheries catches is a lot lower than it was historically. So and we can also look to see, what the composition is of the fisheries catches at present day compared to historic. So that's one thing to note, that we are catching a lot less fish during present times than we were historically. So now if we start to think about this in the context of the climate again, we see that we have this oscillating climate index. We have these warm periods and these cold periods. Then the question might be, okay, what does this mean for the future? What can we expect with global warming? And what can we expect for the local ecosystem? So we really follow from the IPCC framework, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is the United Nations body for assessing science related to climate change. It was created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, implications and future risks, and to put forward adaptation and mitigation options. So interestingly, this is the largest scientific collaboration in history, with more than 800 authors, hundreds more scientists review these documents, and they're based on more than 9,200 peer-reviewed studies. So they're really, if you think about a review paper, this is like a review paper to the max. The text has to be agreed upon by all 195 IPCC member nations, and they're the most comprehensive climate change science resources. So the first assessment report was actually published in 1990, and these reports are published every 5 to 10 years, depending on the assessment period. We had the 6th assessment that was published in 2022, and the 7th assessment is scheduled to be published around 2028. There's also been some interim special reports. If you've heard about the 1.5 degree target or the Paris Agreement, there was a special report that talked about what implications that would have, as well as a report on the oceans and cryosphere. So this is what it looks like. If we think about putting science in a policy framework and putting 195 nations all together in one room to agree on all this scientific text that could be binding for different governments, this is the 27-hour marathon session that it took to get agreement of the wording for the special report on the ocean and cryosphere. And the resulting document is 1,170 pages. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background of the IPCC framework. And this is the framework that they've established is what we're sort of using to address the climate change questions that we have. So one thing that the IPCC has championed this ensemble or model intercomparison approach. So you'll hear me say MIP quite a bit. So that stands for Model Intercomparison Project. And basically they evaluate the amount of agreement for evidence and the amount of evidence that exists. So the type, the amount, the quality, and the consistency. So if we have a lot of evidence and it agrees with each other, we have high confidence in those types of statements. And if we have a low amount of evidence and a low amount of agreement, we have a lower confidence in the statements. And if you've ever read the IPCC documents, they'll have these statements after each sentence: high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence. So they're evaluating every single sentence of what the projections might be for different components. So there's a lot of different climate models out there. They don't always agree with each other. And this is the framework that we've set up in order to figure out how confident we might be in projections of different things. So here's an example. Here's some projections of sea surface temperature, pH, and net primary productivity under different emission scenarios. So we have a low emission scenario shown in blue and a high emission scenario shown in red. And then we've got confidence intervals, which basically represent the agreement of the climate models for each of these different projections. So we can see for sea surface temperature under a low emission scenario, we're going to have about 1.5 degrees warming. Under a high emission scenario, perhaps 4 degrees warming by the end of the century. And we can see that there is a fair bit of variability in these projections. And what's interesting, if we look at pH, you can't even see the confidence intervals. So all the models are agreeing highly on how much the pH will change based on the amount of emissions that get put into the atmosphere. So there's a better agreement for pH than there is for sea surface temperature, for example. And then if we look to net primary productivity, we can see that it's really all over the board. There's not really an agreement even in the direction whether or not we're going to have an increase or a decrease in net primary productivity. And then we can also visualize these on a spatial scale. So here we've got our sea surface temperature on the first row, looking at our low emission scenario here, where we're seeing, that there isn't going to be equal changes in sea surface temperature across the globe. Some areas are going to get warmer than other areas. And we can see that this is intensified if we look at higher emission scenarios. Similarly, from a net primary productivity perspective, we can see that there's some areas that are actually expected to have increases in primary productivity, especially at the high latitudes. And again, once we move to a higher emission scenario, these changes increase and intensify. So we set up a working group called FishMIP, which is the Fisheries Model Intercomparison Project, which is trying to understand what happens when we put these climate change projections of what's happening to the ocean, and we couple these with these ecosystem models that we've been developing, and what can we expect for the changes of fish and biomass in the oceans under these different climate change scenarios. So one of the challenges that we've had within FishMIP is trying to develop a common protocol that all the models can make to produce these climate change projections. So we have a large diversity of these different ecosystem food web models. Some of them are size or age-based, some are food web models, some are species distribution models, some are hybrid models. So they've been constructed with different philosophies and different architectures. They have different drivers, and trying to figure out a way that we can run these simulations in kind of a standardized format so we can compare the output in a standardized format was really a challenge. And it took us about 3 years, the first 3 years of the project, in order to figure out, how to do that. So FishMIP just turned 10 this year. We've got a special issue that's in progress right now, so that that'll be hopefully out by the end of the year. And we've learned a few things about the models, but we've probably opened up more doors of things that we don't know throughout this process of putting all these models together and trying to understand what drives them. So a lot of what we do in FishMIP is we come together and we try to figure out, okay, why is your model doing this? Why is your model doing that? That's wrong. This is wrong. And it's been really interesting process and a great learning experience. So we have a number of workshops where oftentimes we'll have meetings that are tagged on to different conferences. And actually we hosted a FishMIP workshop here in 2022 at the Marine Institute. And we had about 20 or so folks come from all over the world to try to understand what's happening with these models. So now within FishMIP, we've got a network of more than 100 climate and marine ecosystem modelers. We're also thinking about socioeconomic scenarios in the future. So we've brought in social scientists, economists, lawyers, historians, integrated assessment modelers. So yeah, it's quite a diverse group, and I'm going to share with you some of our initial findings. So our first big paper that came out was basically on a global scale, trying to couple those projections of temperature and productivity to our ensemble of global ecosystem models to understand what we might expect for the future of fish and biomass in the ocean. And so here's our main figure showing the change in fish or total animal biomass in the ocean under a high emission scenario compared to a low emission scenario. So we can see projected declines in global fish biomass of up to 17% by the end of the century under a high emission scenario. And again, we see that there is a fair amount of variability in these projections. We also look to see if your choice of climate model impacted the results more, or if your choice of ecosystem model impacted the results more. And we found that there was similar amounts of variability in the projections due to your choice of Earth system model compared to your choice of ecosystem model. And we found that the variability really increased with high emission scenarios. So basically, things become more uncertain with more emissions. We also found that there was about a 5% loss of ocean biomass with every 1 degree Celsius of global warming, and that the biggest losses happened at the top of the food web. So we saw this trophic amplification of the declines. So that was for the CMIP-5 climate emissions scenario. So that was tied to the 5th assessment report. And then there's a 6th set of climate projections that was associated with the 6th assessment report. So we repeated our simulation protocol with the updated climate models, so CMIP-6 versus CMIP-5. And we found that there was an increase in the global decline of biomass of up to about 19% under our high emission scenario for the end of the century. And if we looked at the difference between the CMIPs, so this is basically our old version of climate models from the 5th assessment compared to our newer version of climate models during our 6th assessment. And in a similar fashion, the climate modeling community is trying to improve their models during this interim period. So they're going out there, they're comparing their sea surface temperature projections to observations during the historical period. They're seeing where things don't match, and they're trying to, update the models so that they fit the observed data better during historical periods. So hopefully, these models are improving as we move through time. And if we look at the difference in the direction of, or in the change of biomass between the two CMIPs, we see that there's some areas that are projecting an increase in biomass, and there's some areas that are projecting a decrease in biomass. So one of the findings of this follow-up paper was that the regional shifts in the direction of biomass changes highlight the continued and urgent need to reduce uncertainty in projected responses of marine ecosystems to climate change to help support adaptation planning. So that's, at the global scale. And now we're going to start thinking about, what's happening in our region, and, how much confidence can we have in these global climate models for making projections for what we would expect for Newfoundland and Labrador. So this is what's referred to as a regional oceanographic modeling system, or a ROMS. And basically, if we look at those global models and we plot them for our regional domain, we can see that there's quite a coarse resolution. So these are on a 1 degree latitude grid scale. So this is about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. So it's quite coarsely resolved. And if you have local features such as upwelling or eddies that are really important for driving productivity and dynamics, you're probably going to miss those features if you have this very coarsely resolved global climate model. The trade-off is to run one of those climate models on a global scale is really computationally expensive. So you can't run something on a global scale at a very high resolution because we don't have the computing power to keep up with that these days. So one of the solutions is, instead of using a whole global model, we downscale and we look at just a specific region, and then we can run it at a much higher resolution. But then again, we've got these boundary conditions, so we have to make some assumptions about what's coming in and what's coming out of the boundaries of the model. So there is a model that's been developed at Dalhousie by Katya Fennell in the oceanography department, and it's called the Atlantic Climate Model. And we've been collaborating with Katya and getting the outputs from these regional models to compare to some of the global climate models to see what differences they make for projections for the region. So again, we're going to couple these climate models and their projections for sea surface temperature or sea bottom temperature and primary productivity with our ensemble of regional ecosystem models to see what predictions they're making. So Raquel Ruiz Diaz, she's a PhD candidate here in CIFR. She's been working with species distribution models for the region and trying to understand how individual species are related to temperature and depth. So we can look at some temperature data for the Grand Banks. Here we can see that, there's a warmer section along the southwest region of the Grand Banks, as well as around the edge in general. It's the center part tends to be the coldest part of the Grand Banks. And then we can also look at the bathymetry, so relatively shallow throughout the Grand Banks, and then we see that it really drops off on the shelf break here. So we've got sea bottom temperature projections for a number of different models. So we have two different global models here represented by yellow and purple. The solid line represents a high emissions scenario, shown here and here, and the dotted line represents the low emissions scenario. And then we've got one model run for our ROMs from that model that I showed you in the previous slide. And so what we can see for sea bottom temperature, the two global models disagree with each other quite a bit in terms of how much warming we're expecting to see over the Grand Banks until the end of 2100. And we can see that our ROMs model here, this is our local or regional model, agrees better with this purple model, which is the GFDL model, than it does with the IPSL model. But again, we want to address this from a variability or an ensemble perspective to see how much difference it makes if you choose, one global climate model versus another, and how our regional model, which is better calibrated to regional observations, compares to the two of them. And then if we look at different projections for sea bottom temperature, here we can see a low emission scenario and a high emission scenario for those two global models. And then we can look at a high emission scenario projection for our regional model as well. And so then the idea is we're trying to understand what's the relationship between individual species and temperature and depth during a historical period. And then once we understand what that relationship is between temperature and depth in the historical period, we can run the forecast of the projected temperature change and then look to see what is expected for the biomass response of the species. So here our first example is snow crab. We can see the spatial distribution of snow crab across the Grand Banks during the historical period. We can see its relationship with temperature. So we typically see higher biomass of snow crab at lower temperatures up around 0 or 2 degrees Celsius. And as we increase the temperature, the probability of observing snow crab declines. And we can also look at its depth preference here. So we see it prefers deeper depths up around 500 meters or so. So once we put those relationships and we run them with the expected changes in temperature with our different climate models, we can see under a low emission scenario, one of the models projects that perhaps the biomass won't change that much, whereas the other suggests a moderate decline in biomass. However, if we look at a high emission scenario, all of our models are suggesting a decline in biomass of snow crab of differing magnitudes, again, depending on which model you look at. If we do a similar type of exercise for northern cod, again, we can see its historical kind of abundance across the Grand Banks, its preference for temperature, which here peaks around 5 degrees Celsius, so it likes warmer temperatures, the depth that we typically find it at. And again, if we couple these with the projections of climate models, under a low emission scenario, one of our models suggests perhaps a slight increase in biomass, while another one suggests a decline. So again, we wouldn't have a ton of confidence in what the direction of change might be. However, if we crank up the temperature under a high emission scenario, we see more of our models are now projecting perhaps an increase in biomass of northern cod under those conditions. So the punchline is climate change, warming favors kissing the cod and not the crab. So if there's only one thing you remember, that might be the takeaway. A few of the other takeaways I'll just summarize here. Newfoundland and Labrador marine ecosystems are highly dynamic. We see these cold and warm periods occurring on decadal timescales, and we know that this influences the productivity of the ecosystem. Following the capelin and groundfish collapses, the dominance of the ecosystem and fisheries catches shifted to invertebrates. There's evidence that the ecosystem structure has changed rapidly with this groundfish recovery. However, the productivity and the ecosystem biomass have not recovered, and fisheries catches are low compared to historical levels. Ecosystem-based fisheries management, dynamic reference points, and ecosystem models are useful tools for highly dynamic ecosystems. We've seen that climate change has affected the variability of the climate system and will produce winners and losers for both the ecosystems and fisheries. And I've hoped I managed to convince you that to understand species and fisheries dynamics in highly dynamic ecosystems, it's necessary to consider the climate on decadal scales and ecology at the ecosystem scale. So we basically need to take a bit of a wider view of what's happening with the system. And I didn't have a chance to talk about all of the research that we're doing, but just a teaser of some of the other projects that are ongoing in the lab, and you can chat with the associated folks if they're of interest to you. We're also looking at what is the ecosystem role of harp seals in Newfoundland and Labrador, and Pablo and Hannah are both working on that project. We're also looking at what are fishers' perceptions of impacts to Arctic char and Natsiavit, and Abe's working on that project. We're looking at what is the food web role of northern shrimp in Labrador, and Gustavo's working on that project. We're also looking at how do changes in phytoplankton productivity levels and capelin abundance affect copepod population dynamics, and that's work being led by Jia Ying. And what is the ecosystem structure and function of the North Water Polynya, and how will it be impacted by climate change? And Andrea and Beth, who is a visiting PhD candidate this past summer, are working on that project. And as I mentioned, we have this new CFREF project coming online, and we're going to be looking at what are the bottom-up and top-down roles of zooplankton in Newfoundland and Labrador, and how do they affect the biological carbon pump and the global carbon cycle. So that's something that will be coming in the future. So again, I'd just like to acknowledge all of you guys on the Life Aquatic and all the hard work that you do. It's been fun to try to put this together and think about, what's happening from the system and the climate from, the big scale perspective. I'd also like to thank the folks in CFR, Nancy, Susan, Tasha, who's here, and Tom. We get a lot of support to do a lot of this work. And as you guys are aware, there's a lot of administrative processes that we deal with at MI and MUN. And so just a thanks to the team. It's really a group effort. So I think we've got some time. I'd be happy to take questions if there are any. So thank you.
Great. Question period can commence. If anyone has any questions, just go for it. I'll just get the online.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, if John doesn't ask a question, I know I did something wrong.
I'd like the concept of recovery and the work that you presented. So you showed the ratio of groundfish to vertebrates, I guess, in survey data. And then you showed that groundfish biomass hasn't increased despite that change in the ratio. So I wonder, how do you separate what's the concept of recovery in that sort of scenario where you have change in ratio of groundfish to vertebrates and no increase in groundfish biomass? How do you separate recovery from this concept of the system from sort of zero depletion?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually in my final summary slide, I changed groundfish recovery to groundfish increases. So recent groundfish increases. However, we have not yet seen the ecosystem recovery. And then I have a different PowerPoint version that I used here. So that specific word I actually just changed, 10 minutes before this presentation. But I think it's an important concept, and it's something that Abe and I have wrestled with a lot in terms of the terminology. He was also thinking about regime shifts and recovery. And I think, a lot of these terms are kind of loaded in the literature, and there's a lot of debate over, what is a regime shift, what, quantifies recovery. But to answer your question specifically, I think, we have sort of, from an ecological perspective, we sort of see the representation of these key species happening in more similar proportions than we did see historically. So the relative amount of groundfish compared to invertebrates, for example. But, at this decreased ecosystem productivity level, so we haven't, recovered the total biomass of the system up into this historical state. So I don't think I would call it a full recovery. I would say, again, I just recently changed the word from groundfish increases instead of groundfish recovery. But I think from an ecological perspective, maybe you could make the argument that, there is some type of recovery there. Although some might also argue that if the biomass of the ecosystem hasn't recovered, then that might qualify. So I think it's tricky to define in a black and white sort of context.
Other concepts like introduction of fishing through the food, sort of fishing through the food with adding lower trophic levels to increase the average trophic level. Those catches increases, if they go away, then you might get this pattern of increasing average trophic level as the one at the bottom falling.
Right. So if you hammer the snow crab, then that contribution of the total or the average trophic level is going to be reduced. And yeah, that's a good point. I have to think about that when I'm not on the spot. Thank you.
Was the biomass switch from cod to then to crab, then we're going back to cod? Was the data, is that from just landings or from like where did that come from?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention, this is all DFO survey data. So this is from the DFO survey trials. Yeah, almost exclusively, with the exception of Capeland data, which we use the acoustic surveys for. But pretty much everything has, come from the DFO survey data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any questions online or in the room? I had a quick question.
Sure.
So how often is the EBFM approach actually implemented in fisheries management at this moment?
That's a good question.
If you have a general idea.
It would depend on how you define implemented. So there's a lot of text in fisheries policy that says we will take an EBFM approach. We will consider the interaction of multiple species. Within DFO, they're using the precautionary approach. So how you count, what counts as EBFM, I think would be, the trick there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk. I think the punchline is there's a lot of talk and maybe not less action.
Yeah.
And one of the things, the reasons why we did that review is because there is so much talk, but what are the actual approaches that are being used in order to implement this? And I think part of the challenge is that there's no one size fits all solution. There's not one, implementation that you can do that's going to tick all your EBFM boxes. And given that, different systems have different needs in terms of users and the socioeconomics and the need for protected areas and that kind of thing. So it's difficult. But I would say most, developed fishing nations are moving in that direction relatively slowly. And maybe there's less examples of it in the developing world from kind of the traditional fisheries management perspective, but there are sort of cultural management or traditional management that might sort of still achieve the same outcomes of EBFM, even though it might be called something different. Yeah. So then also sort of trying to figure out whether or not, different things, different management styles are also achieving the outcomes of EBFM. So I think in general, the implementation is increasing. It's pretty slow. And I think for similar reasons why we don't see the dynamic reference points being implemented more frequently, there is a lot of momentum and inertia within these big government institutions that manage fisheries, and they don't typically change quickly, but it seems like they are sort of moving in that general direction. And I'd say that if you want to look to good examples, NOAA in the US, I'd say they're probably world leading, and they produce these ecosystem summary reports that really have defined indicators and how they're like moving towards achieving them. So a lot of the time we'll look to, the NOAA scientists and their literature and what their government agencies are doing as an example to see, you know, what might be possible for the region.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So this might be a silly question, but what would it look like for an EBFM model put into action? What would it look like for a successful area fishery, or and how long do you think something like that would take, where you could say it was a success? You know, would it take 10, 20 years, and do people have enough of a attention span to be like, well, we could have fished, you know, we could have made $1 million or $10 million more for this fishery, for this ecosystem. Let's just get rid of this. It's been 5 years. Just that's enough already.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you think about it from this perspective, if you were actually achieving some of these EBFM goals compared to, you know, what the single species goals might be, that might be one way that you could evaluate it, you know, right off the bat. Pierre Pepin has recently led a paper that was published in Fish and Fisheries last year, where he looked across all of Canada and he looked for instances of EBFM implementation, not necessarily evaluating the outcomes, but whether or not it was taken into consideration during the different stock assessment processes, whether they considered the influence of the climate, the environment, and feeding interactions with other species. So there has been some work that's done to look at that. But again, the outcomes part of it, I don't think has been evaluated as much. And then the other thing is, I think your incentive for the fishery really will explain fishers' behavior as well. And I did my PhD in New Zealand, where they have the individual transferable quota. So you actually own a share of a fishery if you have a license for that fishery, and you can sell that share when you want to get out of the fishery. So there's a certain amount, each share has a value, like, you know, any publicly traded company would. So if you fish the fishery to depletion, your share is worth nothing. So there's an incentive for fishers to maintain the fishery at a productive, sustainable level, so that when they want to get out of the fishery, their quota is worth a lot. So there's examples in New Zealand where fishers have like voluntarily agreed to fish less than the government quota because they think the government quota is too high, and they say, no, we're preemptively going to fish lower to keep, you know, the stock in a healthy shape and our quota value high. So depending on, you know, what incentive system you have in place, it really will influence the behavior of the fishery. So I think that's something to consider as well, you know, within the EBFM and fisheries management context. Nothing online?
I don't think so. You
Yeah.
go ahead, Tracy.
I just have like a follow-up question about that is, do you think that it works well in New Zealand because it's kind of its own like isolated pocket? Whereas here we're like, we share borders with like the States, and so we have all these different people, and like Greenland also as well. So there's all these different people that are quite close by that have different ways of managing it.
I know there was a lot of social unrest when they made the transition from their traditional management system to the individual transferable quota. And basically, you know, if you weren't at the party when they made that switch, you basically, you know, you didn't get a chance to have a license that was worth money. I wouldn't say our geography in Canada would be the limiting factor. We do share a border with the US, but we look to Europe and their fisheries management system, where they have, you know, how many countries in the Mediterranean all fishing the same body of water. And so I think from a complexity point of view, Europe is probably the high end of the spectrum. I think we're probably on the lower end.
Isn't it overfished most of the Mediterranean?
Yeah. Well, that's a problem. You have, you know, 20 countries, 19 of them obey the regulations, and then the 20th doesn't. And then, you know, it's kind of the tragedy of the commons idea that's been put forward in fisheries for a long time.
Okay, I think we should wrap up now. If no one else has any more questions.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Tyler, for your presentation, for starting off the semester strong for our series. I would like to give you a little thank you gift.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's an incentive for more people to present, right?
Let's see how good it is. Ooh, t-shirt.
Yeah, the new MIGS design by our very own Eugenie.
Nice.
Typo, they're all, the back design was supposed, it was just on the back.
Not as bad as an actual typo, though.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And please join us again next Wednesday. We have an exciting talk from UBC's Dr. Danielle Pauly. will be presenting Fish Must Breathe, an introduction to the gill oxygen limitation theory. So that will be an online only presentation, but you can come in person, we'll be showing it here, or you can attend with the WebEx link, which we'll advertise later this week. And also this talk will be found on the YouTube channel, so as well as some previous talks as well. So if you're interested in rewatching anything, or if you missed something, then you could go back on our MIGS YouTube channel. Thanks again. See ya.